Hey guys, welcome back. This is another bonus segment, and this is a fairly lengthy discussion that my friend Asaid and I were having about how to use flashcards properly and the appropriate settings for Anki, and kind of how we think about building, almost like building a second brain using Anki as your flashcard app. The advice in here can apply to any sort of flashcard app, but to be honest, Anki is the most famous one. It's the best one. It's open source. It's free, except on iOS where you have to pay 20 quid for it. It's totally worth it. So yeah, this is the discussion between me and Asaid about how to use Anki properly. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you at the end.
Anki is your Bible.
Anki is essentially sort of the Anki decks, the material on the backs of the cards.
Yeah.
That I learn in a somewhat religious way.
Okay.
Whereas kind of these offhand notes, which I make, really kind of have no real importance to me.
Okay.
Unless I put it into Anki and make an active decision to learn it, I may as well never have written it down.
So you treat Anki as an extension of your brain. Like
Absolutely.
If something is an Anki, it will be uploaded to your brain at some point.
Absolutely.
And so are all of your notes from medical school in Anki? Do you use pre-made decks? How do you use Anki?
So in clinical,
Yeah.
as I said, in preclinical, my way of studying was orientated towards learning information incredibly quickly for the exams. In clinical, because I actually want to remember this
you actually want to
beyond
know this stuff.
just the exams, I use Anki because it facilitates long-term retention.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, Anki is an extension of my brain. Now, the thing with clinical medicine is that it's a somewhat universal discipline, and it's not that sort of what we're taught at Cambridge is going to be radically different to anywhere else.
Yeah.
Whereas the specific undergrad curriculum that we have at Cambridge is quite specific to Cambridge.
Yeah, quite.
And what that means is that you can use decks that other people have made. And so, for example, for the USMLE Step 1, there are amazing decks out there. There are decks there's a deck on pathoma for pathology, which I found really useful.
Yeah.
My housemate, he made a deck based on PassMed, which I found incredibly useful in the run-up to sort of the exams for learning the clinically oriented material that wasn't in the USMLE.
Yeah.
Other than that, there are some decks which I have made myself,
Okay.
so which have been specific to particular exams. So for ethics, for ethics and law, I didn't make a deck. One of my friends, Satnam, he made a deck and really kindly shared it with me, and that was pretty much all I used for the exam. But separately for the SBA exam, I made another deck, which was based on Oxford Assess and Progress.
Yeah.
Now, I never actually had time to go through that deck before the exam, but the information in that deck is something which I do intend to learn for my clinical practice.
Okay, so if it goes in Anki, you have decreed it legit information enough to be uploaded to your brain.
Absolutely.
Oh, interesting. Because it seems like in the US, it seems like the majority med school USMLE strategy is based around Anki.
Yeah.
It just makes sense because it's the perfect thing geared up to this stuff. And like your Microsoft Word document active recall framework, my Google Sheets spaced repetition method, and all this stuff. These are all hacks for when you have to cram for an exam.
Exactly.
That's like 2 months away, or if not less time away. Whereas Anki, it's like
I mean,
you've got the luxury of time.
There are ways of using Anki.
Yeah.
Kind of not really how it was intended, but to achieve that same objective.
The cramming.
Where you essentially cram information on Anki. I found that if you do a deck twice, if you get cards right twice, that's often enough for an exam that you have, which is just around the corner. And the reason I say that is the first time when you're learning the information, it's not synthesized with the rest of the information. So you'll learn individual facts, but they won't come together in your mind. It's the second time you go through the information that you'll link cards to other cards.
Like in your mind.
In your mind, conceptually.
So you think it's okay the first time around? Because one of the issues that I have with Anki personally, and that I know a lot of people struggle with, is that it becomes very easy to lose the forest from the trees. How do you kind of deal with that? Or do you just sort of accept that, first time around, I'm just going to know these in isolation and I'll build up the model over time?
Well, no. As I said, I can't bring myself to learn a card unless I kind of understand what's going on. So I would never just really rote memorize a card, except in very rare sort of exceptional situations. There would usually be some kind of logic for why the structure is as it is, or the answer is what it is. Having said that, even if you can understand a card in isolation, it doesn't mean that necessarily you can synthesize all the cards in a coherent framework in your mind at that point. That's what the second run through facilitates. I mean, and honestly, even the third run through, it's like watching a sort of a complex film many times. You know, sort of each time you watch it, you realize more, you understand a bit more.
Have you seen Dunkirk?
I've seen it once.
I've seen it once, and the first time I did not realize the three storylines were happening. I just did not realize that.
Right.
And I treated them as if it were just one continuous thing. I was like, okay, this is a right film. But I know that if I were to watch it a second time with that knowledge, suddenly a lot more things would make sense.
Absolutely. As in having kind of that kind of sort of foundation laid, where you kind of have the ability to recall other cards, even if you can't do it in a very crisp way.
Yeah.
Means you can start linking information together and synthesizing the cards together into a more coherent picture in your mind. And that's why actually in some ways Anki allows you to memorize in order to understand.
Yeah, I've always felt a bit uneasy with that sort of concept. The way that I would like to be able to approach things is to sort of start off with a broad brushstroke. These are the 30 topics within cardiology and here's how they relate to one another.
Yeah.
And now I'll use Anki to blitz memorize the salient points about each of them.
I would say understanding is an iterative process. And understanding is prior to memorization.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
Yeah.
So I'll understand each card and then memorize it.
Yeah.
But when I do the cards in the second time, there might be a bit of a tension between one card that I'm currently doing and another card which I have in my memory. There might be a bit of a conflict in the information there. And in order to try and resolve that, in order to harmonize the two, that process will increase my level of understanding. And Anki facilitates that because it lets you essentially memorize everything. And you shouldn't expect to have that really kind of high level synthetic level of understanding at that stage, because you haven't kind of filled in you haven't really battle tested your understanding by sort of testing that everything is coherent. And by kind of bringing up these pieces of information, Anki is really testing you. Is your knowledge coherent? Is your understanding coherent?
So the image that sort of comes to mind is sort of like a kind of 64-bit pixel drawing of something, whereby kind of the Anki card, like each Anki card is an individual pixel. And over time, as you learn more and more pixels, you start to see the bigger picture. And then only when you really step back,
absolutely,
once you've got all the pixels in place, you say, oh, I now see the bigger picture.
Except you're also sort of forgetting pixels as you kind of learn them.
You know, the forgetting curve and all that stuff, space repetition, all that stuff. A lot of people say that there's a lot of value in making your own flashcards. I wonder what you think about that, because I probably don't agree with that advice.
I mean, I don't have any evidence either for or against. The advantage of making your own flashcards is that you will most likely understand them, unless you've copied and pasted them. Usually when I use decks made by other people, I have to spend a little while on each card making sure that I actually understand the card.
Yeah.
I would still say that the net time taken is significantly less than were I to actually try and make the deck myself. But it's definitely easier to learn a deck the first time that I've already made than, say, a deck that I've got from someone else.
So if you were to go through medical school again, kind of from day one, you'd say Anki all the way, basically. There was a dude who came second in my year in like literally all of the subjects who was Anki from day one, and that was his Bible.
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, I didn't particularly like using Anki back in first or second year, just because it took a lot more time than just writing out questions where the answers were in the notes. And because it forces you to review things, the rate at which you can progress and learn new information is substantially lower.
Because you've got these I've got 80 cards to review before I get to new material.
Absolutely. And I think to a certain degree in the first 2 years, the knowledge that you're learning isn't necessarily something that you want to keep forever.
Yeah.
And a lot of it you will forget. Whereas in clinical medicine, to a much larger degree, this is something ideally you want to remember for the rest of your career. So, I think Anki is a very versatile tool, and you can use it in multiple ways. You can use it in, you can essentially do this question method on Anki. You can just kind of write the questions on the front of the card,
and just not have an answer.
and just learn it like that. It's essentially exactly the same thing. Or you can do a more comprehensive way where you write out all the answers and then actually do the reviews. And I think, again, it depends what you want out of it. Whether you want to kind of cram to like learn some information that you probably for the exam which you won't really need in the future, whether this is something which ideally you want to know for life.
And so I've read quite a few bits on the internet about how to use Anki properly. And some people say that, well, each flashcard should only have one fact on it. Or you should only be tested on one fact per flashcard. And yet for me, when I was in my third year, I was sort of using Anki to memorize entire paragraphs or essays and things, which is probably not the intended use for Anki, and certainly doesn't, go into this one fact per flashcard. How do you approach this? Like, how big are your flashcards?
Yeah, for me, it's not one fact per flashcard, but it's one concept per flashcard.
Okay.
And a concept can be like deep.
Right.
And it can have multiple things in it. For example, one treatment protocol, I would consider as one concept. I think there's a risk where if you only learn one fact at a time, it's very difficult to actually resynthesize the information on the spot.
Yeah.
And you'll have a lot of disconnected information at the time in your mind, which it's hard to really recruit and recall.
So for example, for you, would atrial fibrillation be a single flashcard?
For instance, atrial fibrillation, maybe in a particular context, such as how you would manage paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, might be a particular flashcard with the first, second line, third line.
But you wouldn't have separate flashcards for first line for paroxysmal AF, second line,
I would steer clear of doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you're kind of fragmenting the concept. There should be some kind of reason in your mind why something is prioritized over another, and if you kind of split them up between cards, I think you lose that kind of bigger picture understanding.
Yeah, so I think like what we're saying then is that overall Anki is a great tool for essentially hacking our memory because of the active recall and the spaced repetition, which, as we both know, are the most efficient study techniques. And yet there is this tension there that actually overall throughout, like, you want to build up this mental model of the subject, you want this thread of understanding to run through everything. And there is a danger that if you just kind of rote memorize with flashcards, which you can do quite easily with Anki, that you will miss the forest.
Absolutely.
And it's about, I suppose it's about keeping that in the back of our minds and thinking and being aware when we are in memorization mode and being like, okay, I'm just memorizing stuff. But really, if someone asked me, to explain liver cirrhosis, I probably wouldn't be able to, because all I have is these isolated, well, I can tell you what gene, contributes to, I can tell you what alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency is, but I really don't know what liver cirrhosis is,
Exactly.
Awesome. Do you have any other tips for Anki/flashcards while we're on that topic? Just because I know you're a big proponent of it.
I would say it is probably worth playing around with some of the settings on Anki. There's a particular website which I can't recall at this point.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I'll put the link in the video description or wherever people are watching this.
Yeah, but I think what's probably most useful, at least from my perspective, is changing the actual intervals with which you test yourself. And I think the standard Anki intervals are 1 and 15. So if you get it right, it'll ask you again 15 minutes later. If you get it wrong, it'll ask you 1 minute later. Then if you get it right, then 15 minutes later. So my intervals, let me check. What are they? So this is my deck setup.
Okay, right. What does all this mean?
So basically,
talk me through your settings.
So I do not have a 1 minute interval.
Okay.
Which means if I get things wrong, it will ask me 15 minutes later.
15? Ooh.
Which means I have to retain information for quite a long time before it counts as memorized. And on top of that, on the converse, it actually facilitates quick learning.
Yeah, I hate the 1 minute interval.
Because
it keeps on repeating stuff.
So by contrast, if you know something, the next time it'll show it to you is 1.5 days later. So that's the next interval, 2,160 minutes.
Okay.
The third interval, 10,080, is 7 days later, and the fourth interval is 28 days later.
Wow, okay.
And what this means is it's basically only when you can remember something after 28 days that it really counts it as you having learnt it.
Yeah.
As opposed to when, in the typical setup where after sort of you getting it right after 15 minutes, it considers that you've learnt it.
Yeah.
And then it goes into its own review calculation, which when it calculates how long to space between reviews, it has its own calculation algorithm, which can basically create problems where if you start getting things wrong multiple times, then it's very difficult to increase the interval back up again, and so you'll keep being tested on a card again and again when you don't necessarily need to be tested on it.
That's what I used to find frustrating about the default Anki settings. But
Whereas this makes sure that doesn't happen, because in order for a card to graduate to that review stage, you have to remember after 28 days, which already indicates a very high level of retention.
Okay, what about the other options on here? Do you have anything else?
So the other ones aren't really too significant, to be honest.
So max reviews per day, 1,000.
I mean, again, that's something you can just change.
So do you do 1,000 reviews a day, or do you just kind of do however many?
No, however many. Sort of, I feel like.
Okay.
I've just put max reviews at 1,000, so that if
It's
there
not
are whatever they are, it does show me,
Yeah.
because I don't typically have more than that. But yeah, no. So I'd say that the main benefit of this is that it facilitates a deeper learning, because you have to recall for 15 minutes, and also if you do already know things, you can get through a deck faster, because you don't have to do things twice on the same day. You only have to do it once.
Yeah.
You only have to get it right once on
And
the
they'll
first
ask you
day, as
a
opposed
day
to
and a half
twice.
later.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And can you talk us through just what your decks look like at the moment?
So, if I go back to the
wow.
decks. So this at the top is the Ethics and Law deck, which Satnam made and he gave for me based on kind of the lecture notes for that. And that's something which I basically crammed before the exam. This is my step 1 master deck here, which has all of the information from the USMLE step 1, which is the Zanki deck plus a few. I mean, I've edited the cards myself. Now there are a few different sub-decks here, because sometimes there are certain topics that I want to focus on.
And is that subjects that you've created?
Yeah, so for instance, sound has cardiac sounds and respiratory sounds in it. To train,
as in like actual...
Yeah, actual kind of like auscultation
Right.
noises, to train me to recognize those.
Okay, and you've done that because they were in the master deck, and then you've just filtered them by tags or something?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then right now, sound has some other stuff in it as well, but that's initially what it was for.
Okay.
Subject 2, I think, has neuro in it. Subject 3, I think, has psychiatry in it. Subject 4 has cardio and renal. At this point, I can't remember what I put in subject 5 and 6.
And you find it handy to split this up into subjects, I guess, because...
It lets me study one thing at a time.
Yeah, and that makes sense, rather than getting a random fact from renal and then a random fact from neurology.
And, absolutely. But when I've learned them, I'll move them back into the master deck.
When you've learned them?
So in the sense that I'll put them in the sub deck so that I can learn them quickly without sort of
getting derailed by other subjects.
Exactly.
So if you're thinking today's going to be my renal day,
exactly,
you're just blitzing through.
I'll put the renal cards in another deck, do the renal cards, and then I can go back to my main deck and do the reviews for the day.
Okay.
Without having to finish all the renal cards necessarily.
Got it.
But then when I have learnt renal, I'll move it back into the main deck.
Okay. And how often do you review? Do you just kind of review this as and when you feel like it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I say, I haven't really done this since May, but before that, I was doing it quite regularly.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
Then this is Doc's Internal Medicine deck, and another deck from Reddit.
Yeah.
This isn't something I've really used that much.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether I will use it. Duke's Pathoma deck is the deck that I used in the run-up to our kind of SBA exams in 5th year. And because there were quite a few subjects I had done with Zanki, but there were a lot of other ones which I hadn't done. About half of the topics within medicine I hadn't covered.
Just
a few weeks
time,
sort of,
just because you hadn't got around to it.
Exactly. And it's too with Zanki, again, you have that kind of structure where each card has one piece of information usually.
Yeah.
Whereas Duke's deck relatively has a lot more information on each card, which isn't great for long-term retention so much, but it means you can learn it a lot faster.
If you're cramming for an exam.
If you're cramming, exactly.
Right.
So
when going back to Zanki, is that based on Pathoma?
Zanki is based on Pathoma and USMLE first aid, and first aid for step 1.
And so is it that you download the deck and then you just start going from it, or how is there some level of you hide all the cards and apart from the subject?
I'll suspend all the cards.
Okay.
And then unsuspend the ones that I want to study. But the ones after I've learned them and I'm reviewing them, I won't resuspend them. I'll sort of keep going through the reviews, and that's why I use decks to separate subjects within unsuspended cards.
Within unsuspended cards. Okay, so within the step 1 master deck, you've probably still got loads of suspended cards that you haven't yet covered.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then, let's say one day you decide, you know what, I'm going to do all of cardiology today.
Yeah.
You would unsuspend all of the cardiology cards.
See, I'll unsuspend cardiology, I'll do cardiology. Now, say I want to do renal, I'll unsuspend renal. But cardiology is also unsuspended, so I'll move renal into another deck to separate them.
And so while you're learning renal itself on the day, it's in a separate deck, so you can just bash
Absolutely,
renal.
focus on that.
But then later on,
I'll move renal back into
and
the
cardiology,
main deck.
now you're reviewing renal and cardiology, which are subjects you're not familiar with.
And now I'll move maybe psychiatry into another deck.
And I suppose that helps solve this conundrum of, if you took all of medicine and just started randomly learning these 10,000 Anki cards, you would not understand a thing.
Absolutely.
But with this method, you can take one subject at a time, and in a way, you can sort of have an active subject that you're sort of actively bashing through just that subject, and then you've got this bank of reviews of stuff that you've already done.
Absolutely.
That's a really good way of taking it.
And I mean, even within that, even within renal, I'll do the physiology and anatomy first, and then do the pathology, again, to make sure I've understood what's going on before I learn what's going wrong.
And so for example, the Zanki deck is all split up, it's tagged appropriately.
It's tagged, according to that kind of division.
And you can just kind of run a query on Anki to say, find me
Well, you don't
renal
even
card.
need to run a query, you just use the tag browser.
Oh,
Select the
so you can
cards
just
and move
click on renal plus anatomy, and then you'll get all the cards that are tagged with renal and anatomy.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, what about for decks that your friends made? So can we have a look at this one? Mm-hmm. And so if we browse through this deck, what do these cards just generally look like?
So this is Satnam's deck again, which is based on ethics and law. This is kind of.
So let's go through this. Right, 8 principles of confidentiality. Wow. Oh, okay, so loads of information per flashcard, but actually,
this is information dense, but
Yeah.
it's kind of geared towards learning very quickly for the exam.
Okay, so this isn't information necessarily you'd want to retain absolutely forever.
Well, no. I mean,
Because if you don't-
certainly I've forgotten this pretty quickly.
Yeah.
If we go back, if we go to browse, and I'm just trying to see.
Safety.
I mean, so again, you've got sort of
Describe our book versus GMC 2005.
case description here,
Yeah.
and
So this is sort of how I was using Anki in my third year, where I'd have on, for example, Badley and H 1972 memory experiment, and then I'd sort of have what experiment they did and what the results of it were. And
absolutely, yeah.
so it seems like we can use Anki just basically as a second brain of sorts for stuff like medicine, with the caveat that actually for conceptual things, perhaps. I mean, Anki is also good for conceptual things. It's just that
It is. I mean, I can show you sort of one of the cards I have. Let's see. It might be in here.
Yeah, because in my kind of second and third year, when I was using Anki properly, it was an extension of my brain. It was as if, like, the instant I added something to my Anki, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that would be uploaded to my brain, just by virtue of the fact that I was going through Anki for several hours each day. And that was such a nice place to be, because it just simplified everything.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what you want to sort of really do. So this is an example of a very, very information-rich card, but it's actually just entirely one concept.
What's the closed ATPase pump in the luminal membrane of the G-intercalated cells that stimulates aldosterone? What is the purpose? Other effects?
So, I mean, basically, this is considering the role that aldosterone plays in generating a contraction alkalosis with the paradoxical aciduria. And it's relatively complex. I mean, there are 3 ways, but even within those ways, there are kind of categories.
So you'd be spending a long time going over this.
So in the sense that I would spend a long time on this card, but in reality, it's all one concept.
Yeah, and that one concept, like loads, like that whole explanation follows from one concept. And once you've
Absolutely.
understood that,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
all
yeah.
makes sense rather than it being distinctive facts that you have to memorize each time.
Exactly.
Interesting. And is this a Zanki card or what?
This
one that you
was
made
a
yourself?
Zanki card, which I've edited.
Okay, so you're comfortable with just adding stuff to
Yeah,
flashcards to
absolutely.
flesh them out and add, because you don't, as you said, you want to be able to understand stuff.
Yeah.
So if you see something in Zanki, in a pre-made Anki deck that you don't understand, you just Google it, blah, 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 and then you add the information to the card.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, in order to understand this one, I feel like I spent 6 hours just Googling until I found the answer. But after that, I felt like the whole of renal medicine just kind of opened up to me.
Interesting. I'll have to check these cards out.
It was the key in many ways.
Fantastic. You're heavy on the pre-made decks. You're heavy on understanding before memorizing.
Yeah.
And even though you can sort of use Anki to, in a way, memorize before you understand, like alongside as you're doing a card, you don't just take things at face value.
No.
If something doesn't make sense, you will spend the time Googling it.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't think you're wasting your time because actually you've got efficiency savings in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, that kind of sort of research in order to understand why a card is the way it is, for me, is in some ways irresistible, as I was saying before. So I could spend hours really trying to understand a particular card, and I wouldn't really, and for me that would be kind of interesting. So I wouldn't really consider it a waste of time.
All right. Well, you've inspired me to get out a Pathoma subscription tonight and get the Zanki deck.
So yeah, this is the discussion between me and Asaid about how to use flashcards, specifically Anki, properly and how to think about it. So I hope you enjoy it. Alrighty, welcome back. We are now moving on to step 3 of the class, and that is about focus. So we've talked about step 1, which is understanding, and step 2, which is remembering, but permeating both of those steps is this idea of focus. We need to actually sit down and do the work in the first place. Then when we're sitting down to doing the work in the first place, we need to not get distracted while we're doing the work. And sort of related to that, we need to be able to take breaks appropriately, and we need to not burn ourselves out studying, because that would just be bad for our physical health and our mental health, and it would also be quite bad for our exam results. So those are the sorts of topics that we're going to be talking about in this focus section. And in this video, I want to share my tactic for dealing with motivation issues. And part of that is the phrase that motivation is a myth. Now, I've talked about this a few times in a couple of different videos and like podcasts and stuff, but I haven't really fully explained it. And the reason motivation is a myth is because motivation, like, what is motivation? We only need motivation to do the things that we don't want to do. And usually those are things that require a short-term pain in order to get long-term gain. Like, we never say, I need motivation to sit down and watch Netflix, or I need motivation to hang out with my friends. We say, I need motivation to work, and I need motivation to go to the gym. Because we know that those are not very pleasant in the short term, but actually lead to good results in the long term. And the way our human psychology works is that we tend to very much overweight short-term benefits rather than long-term benefits, because especially if it's like, oh, I need to do well in my exam so that I can get a job in 10 years' time. That's far too long-term to actually be a reliable method of motivating us in the present. So why is motivation a myth? Well, I think the gold standard approach is to just scrub the word motivation from our vocabulary and replace the concept of motivation with the concept of discipline. So there's an article on a website called Wiz Domination, which I'll link in the show note bit of this class, which basically says that screw motivation, what you need is discipline. And they argue that, you know, there's the thought of, I should do this thing, and then there's the action of doing the thing itself. And motivation kind of lies in the middle. It's like we have the thought, I should do this thing. Motivation is when we say, I need to feel like doing this thing, and the action is then just doing the thing itself. So what this article argues, and what I completely agree with, is that there is absolutely no need for us to feel like doing something before we do the thing. Like, you know, this morning, filming this class, I didn't feel like filming this class, but I did it anyway, because I recognize that the way I feel is completely inconsequential to whether I do the thing or not at all. And there's a few other bits in that article that are quite nice. It says that, I think at one point in the article, they say that a 3-year-old bases its decisions on what it feels like. An adult bases its decisions on what it knows it needs to be doing. And so today, when filming this class, I was trying to be an adult by, you know what, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do it, as opposed to, oh, I need to get myself to feel like doing it first. So the idea of motivation is this sort of infantile fantasy that we need to feel like doing something before we actually do it. And in fact, we can just operate discipline and just do the thing anyway. That's kind of the gold standard. Realistically, you know, I have motivation problems the same as anyone else, especially when it comes to going to the gym. I actually don't mind sitting down and filming this class because it's quite fun. I don't mind studying because it's quite fun, but I really don't enjoy going to the gym, and therefore I need to motivate myself to go to the gym. I recognize that yes, in an ideal world, the word motivation wouldn't even be in my vocabulary. In an ideal world, I would, as Nike would say, just do it. I would just go to the gym, but it's kind of hard. So I personally, I've got a few different ways that I use to help me sort of pluck up the motivation to, overcome that activation energy to actually sit down and do the work in the first place. So I'll break down how I think about this, and then hopefully you can kind of take the concept, if you like, and you can like apply it to your own life. But essentially, when do we need motivation for stuff? We need motivation for stuff where the short term, it's not very pleasant. And usually where the consequences for not doing the thing are not very great. So for example, if I told you, I would give you £1 million to sit down and do your homework, you would jolly well sit down and do your homework. Like, it's not hard. If I told you that if you don't do your homework, you're going to die, you would jolly well sit down and do your homework. But usually we don't operate within those extremes of motivation, because there's no need for motivation there, because in one circumstance, the outcome is so pleasurable in the here and now that we're going to do the work. And in the other one, the punishment for not doing the thing is so great that we're going to do the thing. And those are the two elements of it. So it's like, how pleasurable is this thing to do versus how punishing is the alternative of not doing it. And those are the domains that I think we can target when it comes to motivation. So the way that this works for me is that when I sit down to study, I want it to be a pleasant process. And so often I'll go to a nice library or a hipster coffee shop, or sit on my desk and make sure my desk is clean so it's a nice process. I'll make myself a cup of coffee, or I'll buy a cheeky latte, and I'll have my kind of Spotify study with me playlist playing through my headphones, so that overall it makes the process of studying more pleasant or less unpleasant. With enough of these techniques, for me personally, and because I enjoy my subject and I treat it kind of like a game, that's another useful tactic, to treat studying as a game, because then it makes it more fun. Like, I enjoy studying enough to the point that I don't really need to motivate myself to study anymore, because it's just kind of fun to do. Equally, the other way of addressing this quandary is by targeting the punishment aspect of it. So there's a few of these websites where, let's say you make a commitment that you're going to lose 10 kilograms in the next 6 months. Then 6 months later, if you haven't lost the 10 kilograms, it will debit, let's say, £1,000 from your account and donate it to charity, even donate it to the KKK or, whatever you want. The idea is that the punishment for not doing the task is so great that it's going to make us want to do the task in the first place. The other technique that some people find helpful for this is, let's say I was genuinely serious about wanting to go to the gym every day. I would give £1,000 to my housemate Molly and say, Molly, this £1,000 is yours, keep it safe. If there is ever a single day where I don't go to the gym without a very, very, very good excuse, then you can do whatever you want with that £1,000. It is now yours. So now I've sort of hacked my motivation equation, because now there is a big punishment for me to not go to the gym. Therefore, I'm more likely to go to the gym. And so those are just some of the ways that we can target this motivation thing. I think step one is to recognize that, just the idea of motivation is an infantile fantasy, that, I have to feel like doing work before I sit down and do work. Sometimes I don't feel like going to work in the morning. I still go to work in the morning. It's not an option. But for some reason, we don't treat our sort of study lives or our hobbies or our physical health or our mental health even with the same level of professionalism that we treat our work. Like, it wouldn't be an option for me to not go to work because I don't want to get fired, I don't want to let the team down, etc., etc. But I'm quite happy to not go to the gym because, it's only my body that I'm screwing up, or I'm quite happy to get a takeaway, like I ordered pizza today rather than cook something healthy, because it's only my body, and I don't know why that is. But anyway, kind of the top line gold standard is that motivation is a myth, and that we should scrub the word motivation from our vocabulary. But, we can recognize that that is an ideal that most of us don't attain, including me. And so we can then try and make the thing more pleasurable, or try and make the alternative more unpleasant. So when it comes to studying, what I would do is go to different coffee shops and set a budget of like £20 for the day. Or I'd be like, I'm allowed to buy whatever I want from this coffee shop up to £20. And that's like 6 lattes worth. And so overall of that, just like experience makes studying much more pleasant. Equally, I quite enjoy going to the library or studying with friends, because again, it just makes the act of doing it more pleasurable, and that means I'm more likely to do it. So those are just some thoughts on motivation. There is a good book called The Motivation Myth, which you can read if you like. That talks about this in a bit more detail, and I'll link to this Wiz Domination article. Like, that sort of changed the game for me when it came to thinking about motivation as being a myth and discipline as being the thing to go with. But I'll link that in the show notes or wherever it ends up being. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, so we have plucked up officially the motivation, or rather the discipline, to sit down and do the studying. Now, how do we not get distracted by our phone, by the internet, by something else, a bird flying through the window? How do we not get distracted while doing our work? Well, firstly, I think that kind of comes from enjoying the thing that we're doing. Usually, again, we tend not to get distracted from watching Netflix. We tend not to get distracted from hanging out with our friends or playing sports. We tend to get distracted from doing work. Why is that? Often because it's not that fun. And like sometimes for me, when I'm in that real like flow state where I'm really kind of enjoying what I'm doing, I look up and look at the time and like, damn, an hour has passed and I just never noticed it. And I didn't even think about getting distracted because I was really enjoying what I was doing and I was fully immersed in it. So I think that's point number one. Like if you can enjoy your subject and even if you don't enjoy it, if you can like really fully focus on it. There's a book by Cal Newport called A Deep Work. And he talks about this idea of like really deep, intense focus on something. That level of focus, this flow state, is generally very pleasurable, says the evidence about this stuff. So that means we're less likely to be distracted. The other culprits of things that distract us are firstly our phone. So what I do if I'm studying is I would turn my phone to do not disturb and I would put it face down on the table in front of me or in my bag, or even sometimes if I'm really desperate, I would put it in a different room. And yeah, sometimes people say, oh, what if there's an emergency? But like realistically, when was the last time you had an emergency that you genuinely needed to respond to on your phone? And if there is an emergency, the do not disturb setting, I think lets people call you if they ring twice in a row. Or you can set up like save people that, you know, if mother calls me or if my kid calls me, then the phone will ring. But if anyone else messages, then it won't. So that's another super easy way. It was a super easy thing to do because even to this day, I find myself scrolling through Instagram and being like, oh, how many likes have I got on that pic? Whereas if the phone is face down on silent mode or in a different room entirely, then I just don't think about it. I just kind of do my thing. There's a few other things we can do with the phone. We can increase the amount of friction that it takes to do bad things on our phone. So for example, what my brother does is that he uninstalls Instagram, the app from his phone. So in order to go on Instagram, he has to go on Safari, go on Instagram.com, log in, and then he's on Instagram. And those added few steps mean that he's significantly less likely to actually go on Instagram. What another friend of mine does is that she buries her social media apps in like some random folder on like page 8 of the iPhone. So in order to get there, she has to like scroll, page 8, click on the folder, and then click on Instagram. And that supposedly is enough friction to make her not go on Instagram. And in fact, like that friction is great because like while we're doing the thing, it just gives our brain a chance to think, you know, do I really want to be doing this? Is this really a good use of my time? And sort of on that note, one technique that I found that's completely transformed my sleep is the fact that I now put the phone across the room from me. And on days I find where I'm like, oh, you know, I'll just go on my phone for 5 minutes. I end up staying up. Why is this off? I end up staying up for like 20 minutes or like even 2 hours sometimes when I've got work the next morning at 6 a.m. I end up staying up for an extra 2 hours until 3 a.m. just scrolling through Instagram on my phone and kind of hating myself for doing it. But on the days where I leave the phone on the bedside, you know, across the room on the chest of drawers, I don't get distracted from it, and then I get a much better night's sleep, and I'm much happier for it. There's a few other things you can do. You know, there's all these apps that block apps from your phone and from your computer, you know, self-control and stuff, blocks Facebook, and, you know, there's all these Chrome extensions to remove your Facebook feed if that's what distracts you. Another thing you can do is you can set your phone to grayscale. So, you know, if you just Google, I think on iPhone, you can do it in the accessibility options and display options. So it just removes all the color from your phone. And kind of seeing a phone in grayscale is just a bit like, oh, that's a bit grim. And then it just makes us less likely to want to go on our phone because it's in grayscale mode. That's another thing you can do. But all of these are basically hacks to try and help us focus. Whereas I think that the main thing is to just be able to enjoy the subject and to focus intently on it. Because if we're doing that, then it becomes fun and then we don't feel the need to get distracted by all these other bits and bobs. So yeah, if you have any other methods for helping reduce distractions, I would love to hear that. Comment in the discussion bit of this video and we can all kind of learn from each other and share our tips on how to combat distraction. But yeah, for me, the main thing, phone on silent or on do not disturb rather, so I don't even get notifications, face down across the table from me or even in a different room. And that's how I cope with distractions. So hope you found that video vaguely useful and I will see you in the next video. All right, so we have developed the motivation or the discipline to sit down and do our work. We have been able to not get distracted by using our phone. And now we're focusing for an extended period of time. But we probably want to be taking breaks during that focusing session because there is some evidence. I've got a research paper here that says we propose that deactivating and reactivating your goals allows you to stay focused. From a practical standpoint, our research suggests that when faced with long tasks, such as studying before a final exam or doing your taxes, it is best to impose brief breaks on yourself. Brief mental breaks will actually help you stay focused on your task. So basically, we should be taking breaks while we're studying, but we should be intentional about the breaks that we're taking. And one of the most popular methods for doing this is called the Pomodoro technique. And that was invented by a guy called Francesco Cirillo in the 1990s. And he named it after the timer. He used to use a tomato timer to time his Pomodoro sessions. And that's why it's called the Pomodoro technique or the tomato technique. And the idea behind the Pomodoro technique is that you work for 25 minutes, then you have a 5-minute break. And you work for 25 minutes, have a 5-minute break. Work for 25 minutes, 5-minute break. Work for 25 minutes, 5-minute break. And then after doing 4 work sessions and a 5-minute break, you then take an extended half-an-hour break or 20-minute break or something like that. And then you repeat the process. And the idea is that that 25-minute timer is enough to give us sort of ample time to focus on the thing, but it also means that we have a regular break so that, when we're never gonna kind of get tired of focusing as such. And it's quite a nice sort of rigid structure that we can impose on ourselves to help us maintain focus for longer. There's a few pros and a few cons of this, and I don't really use the Pomodoro technique in that sort of version of it anymore. I used to when I was in my first and second year, and the reason I used to use it is because it's quite a social thing. Like, I would go to the library with my friends and we would all collectively pom together. We called it pomming. And so we would start a pom, with like a tap on the desk, and then we would end the pom with a tap on the desk, and then we would end the 5-minute break with 2 taps, and that would be a sign that the next pom was going to begin. And it was just quite a fun, like, social thing, because everyone could be doing different subjects, and in fact we all were doing different subjects, but we were all in the same library at my college, Emmanuel College, and we would kind of pom together, and it would feel like a sort of shared community group learning session, even though we were all doing different subjects. So that's one of the advantages. The other advantage is that if we find it hard to focus on the thing, or what we're doing just really isn't fun, like doing our taxes or whatever, then the end of that 25-minute session is sort of like a light at the end of the tunnel, and we can think, oh yes, I've only got 7 more minutes to focus, and then we can focus for 7 minutes, and then we can breathe a sigh of relief as we take that break. So that's sort of the benefits of the Pomodoro technique, and of course it forces us to take breaks, so it's good. The reason I don't really use it anymore in that particular realm is that usually when I'm studying, I don't have a problem with focusing for more than 25 minutes. If I'm doing something that's really boring, then I do. But most of the stuff that I do in my life is just generally quite fun. And if I'm studying renal physiology or preparing for an exam or something, then I actually kind of focus for about 40 or 45 minutes before I can sort of internally just sense myself losing focus. And at that point, I'm like, okay, cool, it's been 45 minutes. I'm going to take a 15-minute break and make myself a cup of coffee or something like that. I think the Pomodoro technique does have its benefits, but I don't think we shouldn't like stick to it so rigidly. Like, we should use the technique as a tool rather than being a slave to the technique. And I know lots of people who say things like, oh, I tried the Pomodoro technique, but I got really annoyed when the 25 minutes was up because I actually needed an extra 5 minutes. If you need an extra 5 minutes to finish the bit that you're doing, take the extra 5 minutes. Like, this is just a guideline. It's not really a rule. Sort of like the Pirates Code in Pirates of the Caribbean. But yeah, that's what the Pomodoro method is useful for, and so many people swear by it. There's a few different apps that you can use for it. I think if you just type in Pomodoro timer on Google, it's got one built in. So we used to use that one. There's a website, tomatotimer.com, that also works. And then there's the app that I used to use for this when I was in my 5th year of med school, and that app is called Forest. And the idea behind Forest is that you start your POM session, and the way it works is that it kind of grows a tree for you. And if you go off the app, or if you go to a different app on your phone during that 25 minutes, then your tree dies and you have to start again. So as your tree is growing, you have to kind of stay on the app screen watching the tree grow for 25 minutes, which forces you to not get distracted with your phone. And then the 5-minute break kind of it times it for you, and then it starts a new tree. This is quite a nice way of pomodoroing or pomming, because you know that you can't go on your phone because then your tree's going to die. And they've got like a leaderboard, and you can like connect with your friends and stuff, so you can see who's doing how many Pomodoro sessions in a given day. And you can be like, oh damn, Marcus did 8 hours worth of POMs yesterday. He must be doing really well in exams. Why don't I, motivate myself to do a bit more studying? So that was how I used to use the Pomodoro method in 5th year when preparing for my obstetrics and gynecology and pediatrics exams. But like I said, I don't really use it as rigidly anymore. I think I'm now at the point where I can just kind of focus for 45 minutes, 50 minutes at a time, and then I'll take a break, and yeah, that's all good. So that's the Pomodoro method. If you haven't tried it yet, you might find it works for you. I think it's really great when you're working with friends, because then you can all pom together and then you can all just have a chat in the 5-minute break. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, so we've motivated ourselves to sit down and do the work. We're not getting distracted. We're doing the Pomodoro technique. But do we listen to music or not? And that is the age-old question, isn't it? Basically, what the evidence shows, and I'm going to do like a proper YouTube video on this in a while, but I'll give you a heads up. What the evidence shows is that music with lyrics is probably the worst, because the idea is that the lyrics, if they've got words in them, they interfere with our working memory and the phonological loop, which is sort of the kind of random access memory, sort of the function within our working memory that processes words. And if you've got lyrics in the background or in your ears, and you're trying to read words at the same time, that will cause interference, and that's going to be bad. So music with lyrics is generally considered a bad thing when you're trying to study. Music without lyrics, so instrumental tracks, are sort of a middle ground. There's a few different theories about this. Working in absolute silence is probably the most optimal. because working in absolute silence means that we're not going to get distracted by the music, firstly. And there's this effect in memory, which is that if you're studying for something like an exam in a similar environment to when you actually take the exam, then your performance is going to be increased. So for example, when we take exams, usually we're in a very quiet room, surrounded by the rustling of papers and the sounds of people writing and the occasional cough, but not much else going on. There's certainly no background music, unless you're in like the Senate House in Cambridge and there's someone busking outside the door. There's no background music. There's no like lyrics in the background, definitely. It's basically silence with like scratching of papers. So basically the sort of sound environment that you would get in a library. And they've done some studies where they've compared people who learn like a series of words underwater, then they do better when they're tested underwater, compared to people who learn it on land and then they do better when they're tested on land. But if you learn words on land and you're tested underwater, or you learn them underwater and you're tested on land, then your performance gets reduced. And the idea behind that is that our brain somehow has this association with this sort of environment that you're in when you learn something. And the best way to recall the information is to mimic the environment as best as you can. That tells us that probably working in silence is the best thing. However, what I do, and what most of my friends do, is that we usually work or study to instrumental music. So I've got a playlist on Spotify called Study With Me, which has got like instrumental playlists from film soundtracks and TV shows and video games and like Planet Earth and a bit of classical music in there, a little bit of, piano covers of pop songs. It's like 1,000 different songs, like all sorts of variety, but they're all instrumental with no lyrics. And I find that that's really nice because yes, I recognize that music is probably slightly distracting, and probably if I worked in complete silence, I might give myself a slight edge in terms of performance. But to be honest, listening to music and those sorts of instrumental tracks makes studying so much more pleasant than working in silence that I am more than happy to take that slight hit in productivity just so I can make the process of studying a little bit more efficient. Because, what's the point of getting that extra 0.5% on the exam if we've hated the whole process of studying? Whereas if we can enjoy the process of studying, I'd much rather have a fun year studying at university and get a very slightly reduced mark in the exam rather than not enjoy studying and get a slightly higher mark. I mean, it just kind of depends on priorities. But it means that when I'm studying, the way that I focus is by having, for example, the Lord of the Rings soundtrack in my ears while I'm working. And it's also quite nice because sometimes it gets to bits where I recognize the song and I can sort of breathe for a minute. I can allow myself to get distracted while listening to Concerning Hobbits by Howard Shore, or while listening to Light of the Seven from the Game of Thrones soundtrack or whatever. And I can be like, oh yeah. Or like if like a really nice bit in Harry Potter, like, the Christmas bit of Harry Potter, got a bit of a sore throat. If the Christmas bit in Harry Potter comes up, then I feel like a little spring in my step, even though I'm just kind of sitting there, and it just makes working more fun. Or if it's like a bit of the Game of Thrones soundtrack where people are dying and stuff, then it gets my own heart rate up and just sort of makes studying a little bit more frantic and a little bit more like, okay, the adrenaline's going and, I'm about to be chased by these freaking dragons and I'm going to get killed. And that just makes studying much more pleasant for me, which is why overall I would recommend studying with instrumental tracks, even though the evidence probably says that we should probably be studying in silence. The caveat to this is that let's say you're the sort of person and you've been studying with like, violent rap with lyrics playing in your head like the whole time since you've been studying for your exams. And that is the only thing that can get you in the mood because you've been Pavlovianly conditioned to only respond to stuff when you've got violent rap in your head. And by all means, you can listen to all the violent rap that you like. The point for these study techniques is not that it's a prescriptive, you must do this. Apart from active recall and spaced repetition, you must do that. The point is that it's sort of finding this balance between appreciating what the studies show and what the evidence is, and then kind of taking the bits that work for us and applying it to our own life. So if you want to listen to violent rap or you want to listen to music with lyrics, then by all means go for it. But recognize that if we're optimizing, optimizing focus and stuff, the evidence does suggest that we should probably be studying in silence. But I'm personally going to ignore that and study with instrumentals, which I think is a good middle ground between complete silence, which is boring, and music with lyrics, which is incredibly distracting. So hopefully that was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so we've talked about the Pomodoro technique, which is all about taking a break sort of within your study session, so 25 minutes of work and 5 minutes of break. But in this video, I just want to talk about some general tips for maintaining a healthy-ish work-life balance while studying. I think the most important thing is to realize that really, like, our physical and our mental health comes far above any sort of exam and stuff. And yeah, I get that sometimes we have high stakes exams, but for the most part, our exams really don't matter in the grand scheme of things, especially if they're coming at the expense of our physical or our mental health. And I just find that that's something to keep in the back of my mind, because I've got so many friends who kind of burnt out because
it's so easy when you're at university or you're in school in the right environment, or in the wrong environment rather, to sort of everyone to sort of work each other up to the point where we feel that, oh my God, this exam is literally the most important thing in my life. And because everyone around us seems to be working, then we'll kind of try and kill ourselves working as well. And I don't know, it's just not an ideal way to go about it because, as we're saying, physical and mental health comes first. Secondly, in terms of work-life balance, personally, the thing that worked for me was that I would go to different places to do work, and then I would have my room as like a work-free zone. So for example, when I was in university, I'd be going to different libraries and studying in the different libraries. But then when I'd come back home, I'd sort of had a rule for myself that I'm not gonna let myself study when I'm at home. I would have to study outside the house, and that was a very distinctive sort of work-life separation. But also sometimes what I found useful is to do more of a sort of work-life integration. So especially when it comes to preparing for multiple choice exams where the technique for preparing for those is to just bash through lots of questions on an online question bank. I found that me and quite a few of my other friends, the technique that worked for us was that we just sort of casually be working and doing these questions as we're going about throughout the day. So for example, let's say we're all chilling in a room and we've just ordered some pizza and stuff. Some of us would be on our computers or our laptops kind of doing Anki flashcards or doing questions on past test or past medicine while also kind of having a chat. So that's a sort of more like, it's not a very focused way of studying, but it's a way of getting in the reps of doing the flashcards, of doing the questions while also hanging around with friends and kind of being a little bit sociable. The other really important thing is to, eat well and exercise and stuff. Like a mistake that I made during exam season was I thought, in exam season, I need to sort of really just focus on studying and not actually go to the gym. But I found that for the weeks where I did that, I ended up personally feeling like less good about myself, and that sort of bled into my studying. Whereas even today, if I've got a whole day where I have to churn out a bunch of videos or prepare for a supervision, I still make it a point that 2 or 3 times that week I'm going to go to the gym, because I recognize that actually in the grand scheme of things, my own physical health, my own nutrition, my own mental health and stuff, all of that is far more important than, doing a few more questions or preparing one more YouTube video or like preparing a few more slides for the supervision. So I think the work-life balance thing is really just about recognizing that our priorities and recognizing that studying is not usually top of our priority list. Sure, depending on the exam, in some high stakes exams it has to be, but the other way I like to think of this is that it's okay for life to be out of balance for a short amount of time. Like we can have different seasons in our life where, let's say it is the week before our exams. It's probably reasonable to spend that week just full on focused on cramming and kind of neglecting our friends a little bit, because it's just for a week. It's just for a very short amount of time. But I think what if we're going that far out of balance, we should really keep it in mind and try and redress the balance later on. So yeah, just a few general tips on work-life balance. And in the bonus section, we've got me and my friend Simon discussing some more general tips for work-life balance. So hopefully you'll find that helpful. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. All right, let's talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is how to study effectively with friends. Now, this was something that I was doing like from my first year of university onwards, and I think it was one of the few things that really kind of changed the game in terms of making studying a lot more fun for me. And there's a few tips I've got for studying with friends. So firstly, you want to find the right group of people who's all motivated to study at around about a similar level. There's not much point getting people in the group who absolutely hate studying and who are going to distract everyone. So you kind of want to have a group of friends who are like, a bit of a nerd themselves, ideally. Secondly, I think it's really important that someone in the group takes charge of what the study session is going to look like. So for me and my friends, I was usually the one that took charge because, someone's got to do it. And the way that we would do the session is we would all get together in the library of Emmanuel College, and we'd be using the Pomodoro technique. So we'd have 25 minutes of work and then 5-minute break, 25 minutes of work, 5-minute break. And we would kind of tap on the table to signal when these breaks were starting and finishing. And we had one person who was like the Pomodoro master, who would have the Pomodoro timer up on their screen and who'd be sort of timekeeping for everyone else in the group. And initially this can be daunting, especially if you've not studied with friends before. But I'd really recommend just sort of plucking up the courage and saying to your friends that, hey guys, why don't we all go to the library together and study? You can say it with a bit of a smile on your face as if you're sort of joking, but you're not joking, you're being completely serious. And for the most part, in my experience, people will come along for the ride with you. Maybe you'll get a bit of, such a nerd, I don't want to study, and all this sort of stuff. But, you can leave those people behind. For the most part, most people, like I was friends with at least, were keen on studying with other people because it just makes it infinitely more enjoyable. A few other pointers. So if you're studying the same topic, it can be very easy for, one person to start, shouting out all the answers and the other people to just sort of be like, oh yeah, I knew that. So one point that we would do is that whenever we got multiple of us medics in the room together, and if we were all studying the same thing collectively,
we would, for example, see a flashcard on the screen, and then we would impose like a 10-second silence where everyone had a chance to think about it and ideally write an answer down on paper so they committed themselves to paper. Whereas if it was just a free-for-all, then, Paul, who knew the answer to everything, would just shout out the answer, and the rest of us wouldn't have a chance to actually use active recall to try and dredge up that information from our brains. So the main thing I would say is that if you are doing the same thing, make sure you give everyone in the group a chance to do the thing. And if that requires imposing moments of silence, that's absolutely fine. You might have to be a, totalitarian tyrant for a little while, but everyone will appreciate it in the long run because they'll appreciate kind of being guided through this process of studying with friends. So yeah, studying with friends is great, and I'd really recommend you give it a try, but maybe it'll work for you, maybe it won't. It sort of does depend on the friendship group dynamics, so don't feel bad if it doesn't really work out. But I think it's worth giving a shot because it can have the potential to change your life by making all the studying much more pleasant. So yeah, that's it. How to study effectively with friends. Just some general tips from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Alrighty, so thank you so much for watching the videos in this class. Not sure how many of them you watched, but thank you for enrolling in the class anyway. I really hope you found something, at least something in here that you can take away to hopefully apply to your own life, to your own studying, to make the studying a little bit more efficient and hopefully a little bit more enjoyable so that we can, enjoy the time that we're spending studying, but that we can also free up our time to do other things that are more interesting. So yeah, if you have any comments, any questions or anything, please do leave a comment in the discussion section down below and I will be replying to stuff. You can definitely check out my YouTube channel for more study tips, including some content that's not in this class. There's quite a few things on YouTube for that. And if you're interested in specific apps to help with studying, I've got loads of stuff on how I use Notion, Google Sheets, Anki, and a few other different apps to kind of maximize the efficiency and the enjoyableness of my studying. So yeah, thank you again for watching this class and all the best with your studying, and see you sometime soon. Bye-bye.